My name is Robert Brown.
Can you tell me, Mr. Brown, when and where you were born?
Well, I was born in Winnipeg in 1924, and I lived in Winnipeg right up until the time I joined the Navy.
And what did your father do for a living?
My dad was a carpenter with the CNR. He used to do the fine carpentry work in the dining cars.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I have one sister,
One sister.
a younger sister.
So before joining the Navy, growing up in Winnipeg, do you remember the school system and how it operated?
Yeah. I went to a junior school and a junior high school just a few blocks from home. But when I went to high school, that was 3 miles away. And in those days, I was a runner, and I used to run to school. I'd run the 3 miles in the morning. We had a streetcar that was designated for the school, and it would make stops all the way along and go to the school. I used to give my books to somebody on the streetcar, and when it started moving, I started running, and the idea was that I had to run the 3 miles before it could get to school. So I used to race to school all the time.
So what level of education did you go to?
Well, I never completed my grade 11 before the war. After the war, I went back and completed that and went on to first year university, and then decided that that wasn't what I wanted to do. But that's the education that I had.
So in the late 30s, there were reports of trouble brewing in Europe. Did you pay much attention to that as a young boy?
No, not really. But I heard more of it in the later part of the 30s. I joined the Winnipeg Sea Cadets, and so I had quite a bit of training in the Navy, traditions of the Navy, and so on. So I had some basic knowledge.
And the Depression, what effect did the Depression have on you and your family during that time?
Well, you know, I knew there was a depression, but the attitude in our home never dwelt on it, and I really would never felt the effects of it. There was always food on the table. It may not have been a lot, but there was always food, and nobody ever talked about the hardship.
So you hear Canada is going to war. What was your reaction? Can you remember that?
Well, there were a lot of mixed feelings and some excitement too. And it sounds foolish now when I look back on it, but I was afraid the war was going to be over before I could be in it. I really was. But it was made clear to me that I had to finish out my schooling before I joined up.
So why did you, having that feeling that it might be over before you begin, why did you want to join your branch, which is the Navy? Why did you want to join the service?
Oh, it was a chance to go to sea. And I thought that would be the greatest thing. I'd been in the cadets, and it was a natural outcome of that I should go in the Navy.
And And what might your parents' reaction have been when they were told you were joining the Navy?
Well, my mother had died when I was in grade 10, and we never really had much of a family life after that. And so I finished off the grade 11. I didn't clear all my subjects. I went to work in a gold mine for 6 months, and then I came out and joined up. My dad had been in the First War, and he wanted to go in the Second. And I remember he was so sure he was going to get in the Army and go, and he lied about his age at the recruiting center, but they tripped him up on his birth date, and he ended up in the Home Guard doing guard duty out at Shiloh, Manitoba. And they had German prisoners of war there.
So do you ever wonder, or did you wonder at that time, why the Navy? Why did you choose the Navy?
One of the earliest photographs that I have of myself, I guess it's the first one outside my mother's arms, I was in a sailor suit. And then with the time spent in the Sea Cadets, there was no question. I wanted to be in the Navy.
So if you can give me an idea, after you volunteered and you enlisted for the Navy, what happened next? What happens once that is done?
Well, I joined up in February '43, and they kept us around Winnipeg until they had the group that they wanted, and then they sent us to Cornwallis in Nova Scotia to train as sailors. We had 3 months of training as seamen, and after that we were given an opportunity, a choice. We could either go directly to sea or we could take a trade. And I thought about it, and I thought that after the war, diving would be a good trade in civilian life. So I applied for diver training. And I was informed that the Canadian Navy didn't have any training for divers, but I could get that by going to the Royal Navy submarine service, and I could get it that way. So I applied for that, but that took, that request had to go through Ottawa to be approved. And so in the meantime, while I was waiting for an answer, I took the training as a torpedoman. And it was interesting that when I got through that training, that was the point at which the Canadian Navy, because they had made arrangements with Britain to take over a British cruiser, they didn't have any people trained for service on big ships. So they sent about 1,500 of us to the Royal Navy to spread through the fleet on cruisers so we'd get that training. And that's what happened. I went to Britain, and I was sent to HMS Belfast. And HMS Belfast is now a maritime museum. It's tied up in the Thames at London, near Tower Bridge. It's still there. It's an interesting note that about 1996, they took it to Portsmouth for repainting and cleaning up. And when they went past Greenwich, they fired the big guns again. Just a side note. But We served on the Belfast. We took convoy up to Murmansk in Russia. We were in a battle off North Cape at Christmas in 43. We sank the Scharnhorst off North Cape. And following that, we took aircraft carriers to the coast of Norway to carry out strikes against the German battleship Tirpitz, which was a sister ship to the Bismarck. And we did that. Then we carried an admiral. He was in charge of Cruiser Squadron number 10. And so we went to Normandy, and for the landings, we went in ahead of the troops to bombard the coastal defenses. And so we were there working, shooting up the coast and so on, until all the way through June and on in close to the end of July. But when the troops were so far inland that our guns couldn't help them anymore, then the ship went back to England and we were sent home to Canada. A couple of interesting things there. The ship, the food in the British Navy was quite different from the Canadian. And it was meager. I think that if I hadn't been able to put a lot of bread in my soup, I would never have survived. But I did. But when I was sent back to the Canadian Naval Base in Scotland in preparation for coming back to Canada, I had a really bad outbreak of boils. I had them on my arms, and I developed a large carbuncle on my neck. I couldn't hold my head up, and I had them on my face. The admiral came up to inspect the troops at Greenock, and he went down the lines. We were all lined up. And he stopped in front of me and he said, "What's the matter with you, sailor?" And I said, "Boils, sir." He said, "Bad food, eh?" Well, my automatic reply was, "No, sir, the food is wonderful, sir." That kind of surprised him, but the captain turned to the executive officer and said, "You better see that man get some leave." So I thought maybe I'd get a few days off. It didn't work that way. That was the one time in my life that in my service, that I felt that I was unfairly dealt with. I think about 2 days later, I was in the sick bay getting treatment for the boils. I had these hot foments on my face and neck and so on. And there was a pipe for my group to muster. And I thought, I got all this stuff on. I'm not going to go. I'm going to stay here and finish my medical treatment. That resulted in my being charged with absent from my place of duty. And I was real annoyed over that, especially when I went before the commander and he had that stupid statement. He said, "Sailor, don't you know there's a war on? When you're called, you better be there." I thought, sure, I know there's a war on. I just came back from Normandy. I just battle up north and so on. He gave me 14 days confined to barracks. So I wasn't happy about that because I had friends in Glasgow that I wanted to see. Anyway, they sent us home. And I was told that we could see the Queen Mary down in the Firth from where we were. We were going home on the Queen Mary. And so I went to my divisional officer and what do I do about this 14 days? And I don't want to be under punishment when I get back to Canada, but he told me, he looked at the calendar, he said, no, he said, it'll be all over. The 14 days will be up by the time you get home. So don't worry about it. I said, okay. We got on to the Queen Mary, and our group was called to muster again. And I was part of a group that were taken and set apart. The rest of them, I don't know what they did, but my group, our duty on the ship, and remember I'm under punishment, my duty on the ship was to be a military police on the women's quarters all the way home. What a deal.
Consider that punishment.
Yeah. So that's what happened. And of course, when I got home, that was all passed. I was on leave. And I had 28 days at home in Winnipeg. But the boils got so much worse, and my neck was so bad, they took me into hospital there and cut the big thing out of my neck, and I was able to hold my head up again. And so that happened near the end of my leave, so they kept me on recuperation in Winnipeg, so I got basically an extra week's holiday out of that. Then I went back to Halifax, and because of that delay in getting back, I missed my draft that went to Charleston, South Carolina, and I was kept in Stadacona until it was more appropriate time to go. Because I'd been doing, when I was in Nova Scotia during my original training, I'd done some cross-country running for the Navy, running on a Navy team. And so I was at loose ends. They didn't know what to do with me, but one of the physical training instructors had known me then, and so they put me into the PTI's group, and that was another job they gave me. Teach the women, the Wrens that were there training. I knew something about archery, so I was to teach them archery. So that was another good thing there.
What would that mean, teaching them archery? Can you explain that?
Oh, yeah. Show the girl how to hold the bow and how to hold the arrow, and of course you have to reach around her and help her, and I hugged a lot of them.
So at this point, a young boy is on a ship and having those experiences, and I understand you do continue, but do you ever have the idea that you're going to go home? You're not going to go back to sea after that experience?
Oh, no, I was anxious to go. And I always enjoyed my time on the ship. Russia was paying for war materials in gold bullion. My duties on the ship were, on the British ship, were a crane operator. And I remember in Murmansk loading boxes of gold with the crane. I remember by the time I'd finished loading the stuff onto the deck, there was a pile of gold that must have been, gold boxes. It must have been 15, 20 feet square and about 3 feet high, 4 feet high. And another time, I was in Seyðisfjord in Iceland, and one of the destroyers, a man was injured. He was thrown across the stokehold. He was in pretty bad shape. And they brought him to our ship because we had a medical team and a surgery and so on the ship. And he came. They brought him alongside in an open boat. He was in a I think they call it a striker stretcher, a wire basket, and there was about a 5 or 6 foot swell running. So the boat, when it came alongside the ship, it was going up and down and up and down. The hook on the crane had a big weight on it. And I had to let that hook down so they could hook the basket onto it. And it was trying to control that weight, let the down and bring it up in time with the rise and fall of the boat until they were able to hook onto it. But I managed it, and without dropping the hook on the fella, and we got him on board.
So what type of equipment would you have with yourself for your safety at this point? Did you reach over the boat?
Oh no, I was operating the crane. I was up on a high pedestal. There was no protection from the wind. The wind was coming down the fjord in Iceland, and it was cold. And I was operating controls that were just like they used to have on the streetcars, and you just turn them and run the hook in and out, or raise or lower the arm, or turn the crane. And so I was all right. But I remember it was awful cold. I remember one day going down for lunch, and an old sailor sitting at the table said, "Where have you been? You're late for dinner." And I said, "Well, I've been on the crane all morning." And that fella turned and he handed me his whole mug of rum. He said, "Here, you drink this because you need it a lot more than I do." And that was the first time I ever drank rum. Boy, I'll tell you, when I got that down, it was just like a little fire in my stomach. It just warmed me up. It was a big help.
So you mentioned a few times the cold. Can you kind of let me have a feeling for the coldness? How was your clothing? Were you prepared for that type of cold?
I had a coat issued to me for that job. It was a canvas coat with a sheepskin lining, and that helped a lot. And it had a high collar I could pull up around my ears. But it was cold. It was cold. But got another story there. When we were in Murmansk, got a chance to go ashore, and it was interesting. We saw a German aircraft that had been shot down, and we saw a number of things. But anyway, I was ashore with some English sailors. That was from the Belfast. And we'd gone up on a height of land away from the water. And it was, there was a lot of snow. It was at Christmas time, after the Battle of North Cape. And there were a couple of Russian soldiers there, and they were on skis. And the English lad said, "Hey, Brownie, you're Canadian, you must know how to ski." I said, "Oh, sure." "Well, how about showing us?" I got no skis. Oh, they said, "Go talk to the Russians. Give them a package of cigarettes." So I gave the Russian soldier, I don't know, 1 or 2 packages of cigarettes for the use of his skis. And I put them on. I skied around a bit, and then I was going to go downhill. Now, at the bottom of the hill, it went to the seashore, and of course the open water, and it's damp down there. But up on the hill it was quite dry. So I started down the hill, and I was having a great time. My overcoat was blowing in the wind. But when I got to the bottom, there were two things. There was about a dozen British officers standing there. And at the bottom of the hill, the snow was wet and sticky. And I hit that patch, and I went head over heels, and I went through that group of officers like a bowling ball. And they were pretty upset. But then they realized what they called me was a stupid colonial. But anyway.
So no punishment for that?
Oh, no.
I'm just interested about the morale between the soldiers on the ship, the friendships, the camaraderie. Can you give me a little bit of an idea what that might have been like?
Well, for Canadians in the ship, you always got this business of colonials, that you weren't up to what the British were. There was that discrimination. But among ourselves, the Canadians, the fellow that joined up at the same time I did, and we'd become very good friends, and we took all the same training and so on. We served together on both ships. And when we were on leave when we'd come back to Canada after our service with the British, we met in Winnipeg. My dad was given a week off because of my just coming home. And we were going to our cottage at the lake. And we were in downtown Winnipeg when we met my friend. And I asked him what he was doing. Well, during wartime, you couldn't let anybody know you were coming home. And when he got home, the house was locked up, and his mother was out in BC visiting another son. And so it would be a number of days before she'd be able to get back to Winnipeg. So I asked him to come to the lake with me, and at the lake there was a third fellow there, and it was his birthday. He lived their cottage was across the road from ours. And so we were invited over for coffee and cake. There was another family there at the house, and they had two daughters. And the one daughter and the son of the house and I had all been in the same classroom in school in grades 7, 8, and 9.
Just stop me there, right there.
Just have to change tape.
This is anything.
I don't remember where I was. Oh, we were at the lake. And we hit it off with the girls, at least he did. He and the younger sister really hit it off. And I knew the older sister from school. And we took the girls canoeing, we did a number of things. We went to a dance at the lake. But anyway, that only lasted for a couple of days, and he had to leave, and so it sort of separated at that point. But But he wrote her. They corresponded continuously. After we went back and we commissioned to Uganda and went for another year, they kept corresponding. And I only wrote one letter to the older sister. And after the war, they started going out together. Her parents, her mother, said to the older sister, "You have to go along and chaperone. When they go out, you go along with them." And so I told my friend Ray, I said, "I'll come along and take Gwen along, and I'll keep her out of your hair." So we went out as foursome, and it ended up that Gwen married me, and that was a miracle. When we had gone to the lake, the only way you could get there was by train. And so the social activity at the lake, it was very relaxed, but everybody went to see the train come in. And that day, the younger sister spotted the two of us getting off the train, and she said, "Oh, look at those neat sailors." And her sister looked and said, "That's just stupid old Bert Brown." Well, she finally recognized I was a diamond in the rough, and we've been married 59 years now.
That's great. That's a great story.
It's a story I like to tell young people. Not that particular one, but our ship's company, we have a reunion every 2 years. We've been meeting every 2 years since 1969. And for the last 12 years now, each time we get together, out of our group of 36 torpedomen, there's been 12 show up. Not always the same 12, but there's been 12 show up. Out of the 12, one became an alcoholic and lost everything. He lost his family and his business, the whole works. The next one, his wife died. He remarried. The other 10 have all been married since the war. 60, well, I guess they've all been married over 60 years now. And that's a good story for young people to hear today because of all the divorces we hear about. They're not necessary. Interesting, the fellow that lost his wife, he remarried. And when he remarried, he quit coming to the reunions. And one of the boys asked him, "How come?" And he said that the lady that he had married, his second wife, was a real lady. And he was afraid that the fellows would tell her some of his wartime escapades. And however, the fellows said that they would not do this, and so he's been coming ever since.
Those are great stories.
It's kind of interesting to see the way things happen. My wife and I were in the same room for 3 years. She's a real whiz, and she stood at the top of the class the whole time. In those days, I thought there were too many things in life to see to waste time in school. So I did not stand at the top of the class. And we cannot recall ever speaking to each other in 3 years. So things change. Yeah.
Okay.
So after that time that we were home after the invasion, then we went down to Charleston, South Carolina, and we commissioned the Uganda into the Canadian Navy. It had been glider bombed at the landings in Salerno in Italy, and the bomb had gone through the back end of the ship, exploded underneath it, knocked out the drive shafts for 3 of the 4 propellers, killed I don't know how many men. They got it back to from Italy to Gibraltar. They put a concrete patch on it, and then they left enough people on the ship to make it go. They took off all the gunners and everything, and they sent it back to America on 1 propeller. I don't know what speed they got, probably not much more than 6 or 8 knots. But they sent it across the ocean without any guard, any protection. They just said, go, and good luck. And they made it to Charleston, and they got there safely, and then the ship was repaired and brought up to new standards. And when we got down to Charleston, we just did the finishing touches on the ship and commissioned it into the Canadian Navy. Then we sailed up to Halifax and across to Scapa Flow, and after that headed down to, in England they put on the very latest in radar equipment. And then we went down through the Mediterranean. We went to Alexandria, Egypt, and did our shakedown cruise, practiced all the different things that a ship might have to do, and then continued on out to the Pacific and joined the British Pacific Fleet. And
so you're a sailor on board the HMCS Uganda.
yeah.
Can you share a brief history of the stories of the Uganda?
Well, that was where it came from originally, was the Royal Navy, and the Canadian Navy took it over, and it was the first big ship that the Canadian Navy had. Canadian Navy was a small ship navy. The biggest they had were the destroyers, tribal class destroyers, frigates, and the smaller corvettes. So this was the first big fleet class ship. And so we had been trained in the British Navy for this. When we got out to the Pacific, we were used as a picket ship initially. And you had the fleet consisted of a battleship in the middle and 4 aircraft carriers around it. Then they had a circle of cruisers around those, and then destroyers again around the outside. When we got out there, the Japanese had started suicide bombing. They would load their aircraft with the explosives, and then the pilots were to dive them, crash them into the ships. And the Australian Navy had a cruiser just like ours, and that ship was sunk that way by these planes diving into it. What they did with us, a picket ship was sent outside the fleet, and it was stationed between the enemy and where the fleet was, and their duty was to notify the fleet when there were aircraft coming. So we were warning the fleet. Well, the two picket ships they'd had before us, they were both sunk by these planes. But they changed, we did the picket ship for a bit, and then they changed it and they put us back in the middle of the fleet because our radar was capable of reaching out far enough to give the warning. And that was the value of our ship to the fleet, was that early warning of enemy. But we were attacking the airfields where the planes were, where the Japanese airfields were. We were taking our aircraft carriers close enough that they could go and bomb those fields and put them out of commission. That was while the Americans were fighting on Okinawa, and our job was to try and stop the aircraft, the enemy aircraft, attacking the Americans while they were making their landings and so on. It was a joint operation.
So how did you warn? How did you do the warning? Was it radar?
Well, the radar was the detection, and we could signal the other ships by signal lamp. We generally weren't using the radios, but you could signal the other ships with the lamps. It was interesting. The aircraft carrier alongside us was hit with one of these planes, and it crashed right at the base of the tower on the aircraft carrier. And it right inside the tower was a emergency room, medical emergency room, and it killed I think about 18 men there. One of it was a Canadian doctor serving with the British Navy. It put quite a dent in the ship's deck, and but they put the fire out and pushed the trash over the side, and they were able to retrieve their aircraft that were away on bombing. When they came back, they were able to land on the ship. The damage not being that great. There were a number of British carriers that were hit, the same thing. One of them, the plane crashed on the deck and slid, and all the debris just went over the side. The ship continued on. The ship next to us, they said that they had the damage repaired in a matter of half an hour. The dent in the deck they filled up with fast-drying cement of some sort, and the planes could land, which resulted in the Americans bringing several of their admirals coming over to the British carriers to see how come that they could continue to operate and the Americans ones couldn't. And the difference was that the American aircraft carriers all had wooden decks, and the British carriers had armor-plated decks. And so when they crashed into the Americans, they blew right through the wooden deck into the hangars below, and of course you had all the fuel lines ruptured and so on. You had big fires, and those carriers were generally put out of commission, but the British ones weren't.
So when this would happen on the deck, where were you and what was your responsibility to help control this?
Well, our ship was never hit. We didn't have that problem. But the British ships alongside us, the aircraft carriers, they were the ones that got it. We were never hit. We were very fortunate.
But you would witness this.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So what's going through your mind when you're seeing this happen?
Well, because we weren't actually fighting, we weren't using our guns and so on. Our 4-inch guns were used for anti-aircraft, but my action station was in the shell room, handling, loading big shell, the shells for the big guns into the hoist to go up to the turrets. So when our big guns were operating, I didn't see anything outside the ship. But I remember seeing aircraft coming back from raids, and they'd have I remember seeing one with the tail almost shot off, but they were making it back. I remember one crashing into the sea, and it went straight down, and for a moment it was silhouetted like a cross in the tail, you know. And
Must be something. You can see that all over again.
yeah, I can.
Something like that doesn't leave your mind.
Yeah. The fellows, some of the fellows that we had on board, it was their first time at sea. And some of them had not had any training with the British Navy. And they were having a lot more nerves than we were. We'd been in action before. But some of those fellows were pretty worried.
So a young boy from Winnipeg is in the Pacific Ocean on the HMCS Uganda.
Yeah.
Did you think the end was drawing near?
Well, yeah, we knew that we were. We knew that we were making headway against the Japanese. In fact, shortly before our ship left the fleet, we were close enough to Japan that Mount Fuji was showing up on our radar screen. So we were getting in within 150 miles of the coast, I guess. So we knew the end was coming, but we also had a problem, and that's political. And when it comes to prime ministers, and they start playing politics with war, there's something wrong. And I think our Prime Minister Mackenzie King was a small-minded man who wanted to be big. And if you ever look at any of the photographs when the big three got together, Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, and when they came to Canada to confer, and Mackenzie King trying to weasel in between them to make himself look big. That man was as good as a Japanese torpedo. He took our ship out, if we'd been hit by a Japanese torpedo, it would have been just as effective as his message to the ship to bring us home. And the whole reason for that was that he was playing politics with Quebec. And Quebec was mad about the First World War. They were really upset about conscription. So when the Second War came along, he promised there would be no conscription. Well, then later he had to bring it in. And Quebec, the people in Quebec were really mad about it. And so there had been an agreement made that the concentration, when America came into the war, that they would concentrate on Europe and finish off Hitler first and then go after the Japanese. So King, he said that because he'd had to break his word and bring in conscription, he said, well, we'll make that up, that there was an election coming up, I think it was in May of 1945. And so he said that nobody would have to go to the war in the Pacific if they didn't volunteer. Well, we were already out there. And so some of the fellows writing home, and they were getting letters from home saying, why did you volunteer to go to the Pacific? And the boys writing home would say, well, we didn't. We were out here. So then it was ridiculous. The captain was ordered to have a referendum on the ship to see how many of the crew would volunteer. We're already out there. And we'd already, when we joined up, signed that we would stay in the service for the duration of hostilities. The hostilities weren't over. We'd already volunteered to be out there. So they said, well, you had to have a referendum and see how many would volunteer to be out there. Well, the fellows, a lot of them were fed up and said, we volunteered for a duration of hostilities. Hostilities aren't over, and we're here, but we're not going to volunteer again. We've already done it. And so as a result, they had the original vote, and it didn't work out the way the captain wanted. The captain made a speech to the ship's company about how important we were to the fleet and so on. But we still had to have another vote. And so I think the vote ended up about 55%, something like that, said, no, I'm not going to volunteer again. And as a result, the ship was ordered home. And we were, bad things were said about us by the fleet. And when we got to Hawaii, we stopped at Honolulu to get some fresh supplies. The Americans didn't even want us on shore. They said, no, don't come here. So our ship came right back to Canada. And when we got back to Canada, came directly home. 2 days after I got home in Winnipeg, the war was over. And we should have been out there. We should have been there for the signing of the peace, and in Tokyo Bay. We should have been there. We should have been part of the